Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to this week's installment of the Informal Lecture Series. Today's topic is digitizing tools, tips, and tricks. I am delighted to be your host this week and introduce our presenter, Luc Carboneau. He is a sophomore in the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department. He's double majoring in earth science and physics and is hoping to pursue a degree in planetary geology. Luc has an upcoming NASA internship where he'll work at the Goddard Space Flight Center for 10 weeks, where he will be doing organic chemistry to determine how viable gypsum samples from the Cape Rothus are to be used as a Martian gypsum analog. As well, Luc is working on a Grand Canyon project with Mike Timmons on his dissertation of the geologic map of the Grand Canyon. And Luc is helping to digitize on that, which is part of the reason why this discussion is kind of relevant and why I'm having him present. He's also the president of the Socorro Search and Rescue, a SGA-sponsored club here at New Mexico Tech, and a New Mexico Department of Public Safety recognized search and rescue organization. Since Luc has class partway through this session, we should have time, but I would like everyone to hold their questions until the end, if at all possible. So that he can hopefully get through his presentation before he has to leave for class. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Luc, and thank you for doing this, Luc. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you, Phil, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Phil said, today I'm going to talk about my lessons learned and some tips and tricks that I found after the past few months digitizing in Arc Pro. I previously worked in ArcMap too, so I have a little bit of that knowledge of the transition. I understand that my process and my workflow might be different than yours, probably is going to be different than yours. So I've done my best to remove a workflow from this presentation, but you might see some of those things pop up as I go along. My focus is Arc Pro's functionality and just my observations on that. So with that, let's jump right in. The first thing I want to talk about is options. So Phil already discussed options in the first few lectures in this series, but I want to reiterate a few things before we go into actually digitizing. And the first thing is units. Units are project-specific settings, meaning that every time you bring in a new project over from ArcMap and importing a project, every time you start a project, or even anytime you open a project on your device that might have come from somewhere else, it's worthwhile to go check these units. And just remember that by default, they're going to fall into feet. So we're going to move them to meters and square meters. The most important one for us is this north azimuthal. That is something that's thrown me off a few times, where you go to enter a degree and it's not showing how you think it should. The next thing in our options that I want to talk about is editing. And again, Phil has already discussed a lot of these settings, but I want to show a few things that have a little bit of a conflict with each other. And I actually have a little bit different settings than what Phil showed. So the first thing that I want to highlight is this automatically save edits. This is a great feature in Arc Pro. It allows us to not have to worry about digitizing for long periods of time and losing that data in a crash, or you forget to save as you're closing or anything like that. So automatically save edits is overall great. Sometimes it has its flaws if we are trying to temporarily do something, but knowing that it's there is nice. You'll notice that I have it checked, that I have it set to the default time interval, which is 10 minutes. And notice that this is an application setting. So the reason that this is already set up for me is because I've been working in Arc Pro. These are my settings, how I have them. Now, automatically save edits is great, but it presents two problems with other options here. And this first one is show dialog to confirm save edits. In the first few lectures, Phil mentioned that we can uncheck this because it's a kind of interesting thing to pop up with a dialog every time we want to save. Of course, we want to save. We know that. But if you decide to leave it checked, keep in mind that save edits means any way that this is saving edits. So every time Arc Pro automatically saves edits, for me, that's a default 10 minutes, it shows a dialog. And that's a little frustrating because if we're in the middle of digitizing a line or editing in any way, that's going to interrupt us. And for me, it caused me to have to click, yes, okay, I want to save this, and then go back and undo the things that happened underneath that dialog box. So I chose to leave this unchecked. I didn't need that dialog when I went to save edits manually, and I don't want that dialog when ArcPro automatically saves edits. The next kind of conflict that occurs when we automatically save edits is this deactivate an active editing tool when saving or discarding. Now, in the first few lectures, Phil actually had this checked, and I have it unchecked for the reason that when saving, including automatically saving, my tool is deactivated. Now, luckily, this does not interrupt our editing. So if we are actively creating a line or a feature, we won't get kicked out of that tool as we're going. But the moment you click finish that line, there goes your tool. This isn't really an issue because we can keep going and selecting that tool, but it bothered me and it slowed me down a little bit. So keep in mind that if you choose to deactivate an active editing tool when saving or discarding, this saving includes automatically saving edits. Now, options are very user specific, so play with it a little bit, choose the settings that are best for you, but keep in mind that there are some things that clash a little bit, especially for our workflow. I'm going to click OK to save my options and head back to the project. The next thing that I want to highlight before we get into proper digitizing is scales. We can find our scale down here at the bottom left of the extent. And if I open this drop-down menu, you'll see that ArcPro comes with some default scales in it. Now, these default scales right now mean nothing unless we go click them, because as I zoom in, you'll notice that it gives me kind of random numbers. One of the issues that I found is, you'll notice right now I'm at 1/10,066. If I zoom in with one zoom tool, for example, for me, that's a mouse right now, and I zoom out with a different zoom tool, I have a digitizing monitor, so I'm going to use that. You'll notice it went to a different number. That bothered me because when I'm up close creating a feature, I want to be able to zoom in and out and get to the exact same place that I was at. So the solution for that is going to this, if you didn't see that, drop down and customize, and we can select only display these scales when zooming. That only shows us scales from this list. Now you'll notice that if I zoom in, there's not many in that list. So the second thing we can do under this customize is manually add smaller scales or whatever scales you'd like to make our workflow a little bit better. Now, once you've set these up, you can set them as a default. And to my knowledge, this default is true for your user profile. You see I'm signed in right here, or your local device. Don't exactly quote me on that, but that is what I found this default means. So I've had a default set up, and if I click user profile default scales, you'll notice it enters a bunch that I've already manually created. I can then only display these scales. And now if I'm at 1/1000, I zoom out or in with one tool and zoom out with a different one, it goes right back to where it was. This is not vital to the digitizing process. But if you're like me and you want to be able to recreate what you just saw, this is a helpful way to do it. And knowing how to manually enter these unique scales is valuable. For example, 1:1 is a scale that's not there by default. And for us, that might be really helpful if you're looking at a feature or a feature error that gets really, really small and you have to zoom right up into it to see what's going on. In the case that you want to go back, you can always load factory default settings. I'm not going to do that today. Keep in mind that scales are project specific. So every time you open a new project, those scales are just going to be that factory default. But if you set up your user profile default, it's 1 or 2 buttons to get you back to this step. All right, the next thing I'm going to set up before we get into the rest is my panes. So you'll notice that over here on the right, I have a bunch of panes open. For example, I'm on the Create Features pane right now. These panes are found all over the Arc Pro interface. For example, this Create Features is actually under the Edit tab. I have to turn on editing. For me, I have that optional turn on editing selected in the settings. I have to turn on editing, and then I get that toggle, that button to open this pane again. So my biggest recommendation here is once you have used something like this, one of these panes, you will probably use it again. So leave it open. They don't take up that much space. They can always be pushed to the side if we need to. But that's the reason why I have all of these things open, is because this is what I've used and I don't want to go hunting for it again. The nice thing is, if you do happen to close it, once you set the location here on this tab, it'll pop right back up in that same location. So I always know where my Create Features is. It's always right about here on my screen. I didn't choose that. I just let it open as it did, and I now have memorized where it is. But in case you wanted to make it first, you can move it along. So these are really helpful. Almost all of your tools will be found, or almost all the stuff that you do will be found in these panes. And because they're a little bit of a pain to find, then it's worthwhile to leave them open as you open them for the first time. All right, so now that I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit. Now that our options are set up well, now that the scales are set up well, and now that we have the panes that we want, we can go into digitizing. The first thing that I want to show in digitizing, I'm actually going to scroll to this corner up here. The first thing I want to show is the difference between cancel, discard, and delete. All three of these things get rid of a feature, but they do so in different ways from each other, and they do it at different times, different stages throughout the digitizing process. So if I create a feature, I'm going to do this quick and poor, but if I create a feature and I don't finish this sketch, this is an uncommitted sketch, I can go down here and do the first of the three, which is cancel. So like I said, this is not a committed sketch. I have not pressed F2. I have not double clicked. I have not finished right here. I can press cancel. That feature goes away. The next one is discard. Now, if I do press F2, double click, or this button down here to finish, this is a committed sketch. This cancel will just knock me out of the tool. You see it knocked me out of the tool, it got rid of it, but that feature is still there. But because we haven't saved our edits yet, that's where this discard comes in. Keep in mind that this doesn't discard what you just did or the selected feature. It discards everything since the last save. So in my case, I only have one thing that's unsaved. But if I press discard, there's my dialog box, and it'll get rid of it. So the first one was cancel. That's for uncommitted features or uncommitted edits if you're using other tools later on. The next one's discard. That's for unsaved edits. And the final one, if I go create my feature again, I apply it or finish it. I'm going to use this version, this option down here. I save it. Notice I can't discard anymore. Then we have our good old-fashioned delete, which deletes anything that's selected in the map. Also shows the dialog. So these three things all get rid of features, but they do so different stages, and it's actually kind of nice to have a different option. Maybe I don't want to go select and then delete. Maybe I just want to say, nope, I don't want to do that, and I can cancel. Or I was testing something out, and if I haven't saved yet, or it hasn't automatically saved yet, I can just go discard those features. So it's important to know, and it's tripped me up a little bit, the difference between cancel, discard up here, and delete. Nothing selected, so I can't show it right now. All right, now the fun part, which is lines, digitizing line features. In ArcPro, we now have 4 known ways to digitize lines that works with what we want to do. And before I go into those, I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology because I'm going to go through them kind of fast. These right here where my mouse is, inside a template, we have this line of tools. I will call them editing tools. When I select one, for example, what I just selected there, it opens the editing toolbar, which were formerly in ArcMap the advanced editing options. But for my purposes, I'm going to call these down here modes. That's just a shorthand way. We have not found any actual documentation that calls it that, but it's easier for this presentation where this is our tool, this is our mode. So the first way that we can digitize a line is with our line tool in line mode, which is what I have selected now. This is what everyone here is familiar with, where we select vertex by vertex and we draw straight lines in between. By default, just like ArcMap, we can double click to finish, something that I actually turned off. That is a setting you can do. We can press F2 to apply this sketch, or we can go down to this editing toolbar and finish here. This way is what we're all familiar with. We edit or we digitize vertex by vertex, straight lines drawn in between. The second way is in our line tool, we can now go to this drop-down menu into streaming mode. This was also a feature in ArcMap, but if you're not familiar with it yet, what streaming mode does is we can select once, draw our line, which I'm doing poorly, and select second time to pause. It's not finished yet. For those of you who have used streaming, you might have noticed, whoa, that's a lot of vertices. So let's go fix that. I'm going to discard this because I don't want it. With cancel, sorry, I'm going to cancel this because I don't want it. Our streaming options to fix those lots of vertices are found in 2 places. Either under this tool, we can press O for options, or you can go search it up here in the command search. And what I've actually done is pinned it right here. The reason I've pinned it is because in ArcPro right now, you have to set your stream options every single time you start up the program. So this is not project specific. This is not application specific. This is just something you have to do every startup. And that's why I have it pinned up here, is because it's easy, quick and easy to find. So I'm going to set a tolerance at, say, 6 meters. I'll talk about this smooth option later. And now I can go make sure I'm on the tool. I can go redraw that line. Now we have less vertices. Let's finish that, and I'm going to edit vertices so we can see this again. Now, again, for those of you who are familiar with streaming, what you'll notice is that in some cases, I have, for example, right here, I have a vertice here and a vertice here. That is probably 6 meters apart. But I also have a vertice here that is a lot further away. One difference that we have found between ArcMap and ArcPro is that whereas ArcMap placed a vertex at the tolerance, so every 6 meters, ArcPro sets that as a minimum tolerance. So if it thinks that you drew a fairly straight line, it'll save data by omitting placing vertices every 6 meters. So here's my minimum. That's the as I curved my mouse. And here is it thinks I drew a straight line. So one thing to keep in mind is that if we say, oh, I wanted this to be a stronger curve, a tighter curve, that we'd have to go manually add vertices later. All right, so far we have our, let me apply that. We have our line tool in line mode, our line tool in streaming mode. The next one is freehand. And that is found right here in this little squiggle. Freehand was actually an option in ArcMap, but it didn't work for our purposes. And now it does, which is great. Because what freehand does is instead of using individual vertices, it uses Bezier curves. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Bezier curves, they're paths that are created by a polynomial function with a vector control point. And so in our case, this means that we create a curved feature where we have both a vertex and handles to control that curve. The history and math behind Bezier curves is actually really interesting. I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole as I was researching it. So if that's something that interests you, I would recommend going down the rabbit hole. But let's see how that works for us. So I'm selected on freehand. Notice there are no modes. It's just one way to do it. And the first thing you'll notice is that as I go up to where I want to start, there's no snapping. I have my snapping turned on up here, but for freehand, we actually have to force snapping. And how we do that by default is spacebar. You'll notice it kicked me out of the tool there. That is a known error. If it ever does that, go select something else, come back. There it goes. So I'm holding down spacebar, and now I can snap to the end of this line. This works very similar to streaming in that we just click once, draw what we want, and click twice. You notice that when I click twice, it did not pause that sketch, it finished it. And that is something else that we have to keep in mind of streaming does not behave normally with freehand, and we can't pause it. We just have to go pretty much one shot for drawing this line in freehand. Now, if we go to edit vertices, we can see these Bezier curves. Let me find a good one here. This is a good one. So you'll see that we have our vertex and we have our handles. And what we can do with this, let me actually bring it to the line. What we can do with this is change the curvature in both direction by the angle and magnitude by the length. And so if I create something really wild here, what you'll notice is that if I wanted to draw this with vertices, I would have had to place a lot of points to capture this level of detail. But I'm in fact only doing it with one, maybe three if you include these guys. So ultimately, this is a data saving method. If we have big long lines that would have, or very detailed lines that would have had lots of vertices in them, we can reduce that by using Bezier curves. So that is an advantage of freehand. One of the disadvantages, or two of the disadvantages, are, as I showed earlier, snapping behaves a little bit differently. And when we click, we finish the line. Just single click finishes that feature. So that brings us to our fourth way we can digitize a line feature in ArcPro, which is a little bit of a combination of some of these. And that is in line tool, in streaming mode. But this time I'm going to press O to open options, and I'm going to press smooth. And what smooth does is it converts all of our vertices to Bezier curves. So now you'll notice snapping, let me move down a little bit. Snapping is honored. Pausing is honored. Click to pause, click again to start. And if I finish this, you'll notice that it created Bezier curves. Open edit feature, edit vertices so we can see that. Now, one of the downsides is that it still honors that minimum tolerance. So you might get not as sharp curves by default, but because of this handle, these vertices and handles, we can go adjust that later. Another downside of Bezier curves, as you saw here, is I was actually pretty close to this line, but it over-exaggerated it. If you're doing very tight corners, or especially 90-degree corners, then you are definitely going to see this over-exaggeration, and you'll have to go back and think about, what was captured based on what I drew. All right, so that brings us to our four methods of drawing lines in ArcPro. The first was our line tool in line mode, which draws vertex by vertex, straight lines in between. The next was line tool in streaming mode with no smoothing. That is vertex by vertex, but we don't have to place them. We draw at the end, or at the beginning to the end, straight lines in between. Freehand, which introduces Bezier curves, but does not honor snapping. And when we click, we finish that sketch. And finally, line tool, streaming mode with, over options, smooth selected. And that is to me the best of all of these. But as you go through, you might find that different methods of digitizing a line works best for your workflow. All right, I'm going to leave these here. And one last thing that I want to show for editing lines or digitizing lines is if you ever come to a template and you see something like this little error message here, notice that if we try to draw something with that error message, I'll go apply it, it throws us an error, didn't actually apply it. These messages means that something in the template isn't working well with Pro. And one of the nice things is that it actually shows us where this is. So I can right click, go to properties, go to attributes, and it's highlighted right there that it needs a data source. For ArcMap, our DS ## worked. ArcPro does not like that format, so it's going to force us to enter a data source into our template. So I can click OK. You notice it went green. Notice that there is no more error message. And if I go apply this, it applies. So just keep in mind, as you are bringing in, especially bringing in things from ArcMap, there might be some things like that where you get these either red circles or yellow triangles, which means that something else is wrong, but it'll still kind of draw your line. These are pretty easy to fix. They're just found in that properties attributes right there. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is the error inspector. Let's go draw something real quick down here that we know will create errors. So I have right there an intersect and 2 dangles. So we know this will create errors. Error inspector is found under this edit tab right here. It'll pop up down here by default. You can also move it around. And validate is now found right here. This works exactly the same as ArcMap. You'll notice it threw me the 3 errors I was expecting. However, if I zoom in and hide one of those, it'll only show me 2. And that is because this map extent is every time you open ArcPro selected. This is another one of those settings like streaming options that if you want to see all your errors, not just the errors that are shown in the extent you're looking at, you have to go select this every time. Now, if, for example, of course, I click the one I didn't want. If I mark one as an exception, you notice that now it turns green, which is pretty cool. If I mark one as an exception, it still shows. That's another thing by default. Every time you open, in rules, we can go say, we don't want to see those exceptions on our list here. Ultimately, Error Inspector works pretty much the same as, for our purposes, it works the same as ArcMap. Just keep in mind that a few things like map extent and show exceptions are selected every time you open the program, and that a few things have moved around. Another thing that's new is that you get this nice preview window. So if, for example, I'm all the way over here, but I want to look at what this error is, I can see it right there. And the reason it's so big is because I have a reference scale set, but you can zoom on this preview window. And so maybe you don't want to scroll all the way over to see if this is an exception or not, especially for something like this that's a dangle. This preview window is nice for that. All right, I'm going to close that. And I'm just going to turn off my topology so we don't see those. Now, you might have seen me throughout the presentation referencing some of these tools up here. And this is actually the Modify Features pane, which opens right here. This is where we find all of those editing tools that we might need. But there's this nice toolbar up here that if we open, has all the same stuff and the ability to right-click and add to favorites, which is what I've done up here. Unfortunately, this favorites is a project-specific thing. Most favorites in ArcPro are project-specific, but it's nice to add these up here because, as you saw, I was going up here and editing vertices, or maybe I want to continue the feature, etc. This is a good time to mention that favorites are your friend in ArcPro. They help you become more efficient. There are lots of different places inside the interface where you can favorite things, move things around to fit you, or, for example, up here, select tools that you use quite frequently. I have found that really helpful of favoriting things, pinning things. It helps me memorize where a tool is going to be. So this is just one example of that favorites of in these tools. We can select things I was using all the time. Like I said, you saw me jumping back and forth. But as you're going through, if you find something that you're using all the time, might be worthwhile to see if you can favorite that. All right, I'm going to go back to select. The final thing that I want to talk about today is point features. And unfortunately, when I went to choose this map for this presentation, I found that it has 0 orientation points. So we are just going to make something up in the middle of this unit here. Let's use an incline bedding, and we can place it. Point features ultimately act the exact same as they did in ArcMap. We can place them, we can go to their attributes, which is another pane, and we can change their azimuth and inclination. We'll just do that. They also still obey tools like rotate. But keep in mind that if you are one of those people that uses rotate in your workflow, if we go back to the attributes, it adds, oh, I have to actually apply it. It adds a level of precision that's not actually realistic. So it might be worthwhile to either just type in your value or make sure you're going and rounding that number. So like I said, ultimately these point features work exact same. The one difference that I want to highlight is its selectability. So if I zoom in here, you might be familiar with point features in ArcMap where we had to go right here on this incline bedding. And we'd see if we had snapping on, we'd see that little point right there. We'd have to select it and then we'd get it. Well, the cool thing is in Arc Pro, it knows where this whole symbol is. So I can select all the way up in this corner and it'll still select it. The only thing that it won't select is the label. Notice that did nothing. But if I get this corner in, we get that. This is super helpful because if you have a lot of point features, especially right next to each other, you might not want to spend time finding that little point or remember, oh, I have to go turn on my snapping to get right there, anything like that. It's super helpful to be able to find these corners. This works for even symbols like an overturned bedding that has that nice swoop there. That's a super helpful feature. But ultimately, point features work exact same. All right, so just a quick recap. The first thing I talked about was our options. Like I said, options are very user specific, but keep in mind that there are a few things that clash with each other as we're messing with those default settings. So play around with it. Feel free to reference this presentation or some of the first presentations that Phil did to see what would work best for you. And also check your units every time you start a new project or import a project over from ArcMap. Next thing I talked about were scales, not a vital function for digitizing, but if you're like me, you want to see those very discrete values of scales, or you want all of your different ways of zooming to work congruently together, all of that customization is found here. The next thing was our line features, which will remember that there are 3 different ways to delete something: cancel, discard, and delete. And that there are 4 different ways to draw lines: our line on line mode, our line on stream mode, freehand, and line on stream with smoothing. And if we ever see an error in our template, it's an easy enough fix inside properties of that template. Then we opened our error inspector. Works exact same as ArcMap, just some things have moved around and some of those toggles have been checked when we open up Arc Pro every single time. And our modify features up here, it's its own pane, or we have this nice drop-down menu, helpful to favorite some of those tools and helpful to favorite things that you use along the way in other locations. And then finally, our point features, again, working exact same as ArcMap, but now have more content-aware selectability. And if there's a few things that you should get out of this presentation, I'd say that ultimately it's very user-specific on what you're going to find works best for you, but keep in mind some of these things that we found that might help you get through that trial and error process a little bit quicker. Keep in mind that favorites are your friend, keeping panes open are your friend, setting up the interface to work best for you is very helpful. And Pro is very content aware. It's very helpful to be able to do the digitizing that we're doing with a little bit of a help from the program itself. All right, well, that's all I have to cover today. I know that this was a lot of information packed together in a very short amount of time, so I invite you to go back and rewatch this on the YouTube playlist that Phil has. That's where this will be posted. And I do have some time before I have to go. So if there are any questions that are specific to what I talked about, I invite you to jump in now or place them in the chat, and then we'll have the general questions after that.
Thank you very much, Luke. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I got one. It was about the error when you're selecting in the Create Features tab for for like a line or anything like that.
Yeah.
It gives you that error. Now I've been doing this probably the wrong way. I've been hitting that arrow. Have you had any experience where you hit that arrow and it takes you to manage, and then you set everything up in the template, but it doesn't save those changes? What's going on with that?
Yes. So the arrow, so what Tyler was referring to is that there's this arrow on the side that throws you over to this active template. What we found is that selecting it here edits the attributes for the features you are about to create. And so once I go select off and select back, that wasn't the thing that we were about to create. So that's why it works for the rest of that template if we go to the properties. So this is a solution to that.
Okay, cool.
But it only works for what we're about to create, not for the template as a whole.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's the reason why the comment in the chat is ultimately we want to get that one fixed because that's an easy one to fix. And it's a byproduct of the fact that we have originally created these templates with generic DSOO, DSO1, DSO2, DSO3. What everyone will start seeing in the templates is that everybody's name will be in there. And that's the part of our job, is to keep track and maintain that attribute table, that data table of data sources, so that we have a running list so that everyone's domain data source is in that list by default. And my recommendation for that is every time you start a project and you're working with the mapping kit, one of the first things you should do is go to the layer property settings, go through that create features templates, and by default set all of your user templates to that data source. The other thing that we can do with this as well is also set up attribute rules that then ask that can deal with some of those things and or ask you when digitizing what you want those to be. And we're still working out all the nuance of that. So
I got another question if nobody else got one.
Go ahead.
Just going to comment on your question or say more about what Luke just said. That arrow thing only happens like the one time. And if you go back off the tool and go back on it, it does go away. But you can keep doing that if you want. If you like that flow, if that's your thing.
That's what I've been doing.
Yeah, I don't know. But and you can get to those properties in two different ways too, but that is the fastest way to get to those properties.
And I'm going to chime in really quick before we go to your question, Tyler. And that's exactly what the controls up here are for. So if you come to this, in here, you've pulled up all the properties. You can select everything of a like group. And I'm just going to grab some of these, come to the properties, and then in the attributes, you can set that data source to be the data source that you want it to be. Click OK, and then it will honor that from that point moving forward, because the template now understands that instead of the DS pound or hashtag, sorry, whatever you want to call that, it recognizes now that there's an actual one in the domain, which is what the problem ultimately is DS ## is not in the domain, and that's why it's upset.
I've also seen some errors that come up where it's like it doesn't understand the type field, and it's just a quirky thing that it does. So sometimes you just have to go into those properties and fix it. But I think those are mostly like the yield errors, the yellow errors versus the red errors.
So I got another one about the rotate tool. I know, yeah, we use that SQL query to like round them, but is there not like did Pro not come out with like a significant figures for how you want to rotate? Does anybody know? Or it's still just gonna give you all those.
Phil, that's a question for you.
I'm going to chime in on that one. It has to do with a GEMS data model problem. If
Okay.
that was set to integer, if I'm making assumptions here, so I'm going to start off with that. I'm making assumptions, but let's assume that it's set to an integer field. If it's set to an integer field, it can't contain those decimal precision to the values because the type, the field type, can't hold that precision. So it would dump those off. But that's an assumption based off of that. GEMS makes that field be, Amy, you're going to have to correct me on this, a float if memory serves, or a double precision data type. And with that comes that extreme level of precision that is incapable of being captured on a brunt. If you were to do that by a calculation and you're averaging some like bedding plane orientations or something like that, you may want to have that average to that decimal place. But again, your Brunton usually, I mean, at best, you should be reporting the values that you measure to half a degree at best, because you don't have the actual ticks in between each individual degree to claim the precision that that can contain. And I usually, contain it to 1 degree. I think the error that we ascribe by default is probably plus or minus 2 degrees. It's one of those 1 degree plus or minus 1 degree. So it's and it's because of the precision of those ticks, and those are the things. But it would have to change the data type in order to set that to be a whole number integer. But GEMS, and I think if I can say this without getting in trouble, I think they're wrong on that one, because the precision of a Brunton is not capable of containing that type of information. You should only report it to what it could be, but they're holding that data type to be that high level of precision, and I disagree with it. It shouldn't be, because it should be at the level of precision for the data that's being captured. Mark, you've got a comment?
Yeah, two things. One is, as far as data is concerned, you're absolutely correct, Phil. If you have an integer value in any place in the data, the decimal places are basically discarded. Now you got to be careful sometimes when you're going from a floating point to an integer, depending upon where you are, it doesn't round the value, it truncates the value. So that can mess you up. But to the other point that Phil was making, absolutely agree that even the best Brunton, at best, you can get a half a degree. But I have worked with some data in an older Esri product where we were working with surveyors data, which they had in our case out to 2 decimal places. So I can see why it's in the product, even though we don't use it.
Great comments. Thank you, Mark.
But thanks, Luke. Great stuff.
Thank you.
Bill, can I get him transferred to the IT group?
No. And the problem is Luke, plug your ears. We're probably going to lose him, and it makes me grumpy because he's an amazing asset to this team dramatically. So
can we pay off a professor so he doesn't finish his last class?
let's
I've
talk
already
later.
tried.
Let's talk later. Let's the three of us get together. We'll work on that.
We're saying this lovingly, Luke. We really are.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Well, I got
Phil.
a question. I noticed there must be a setting I have on, but I don't know. Anyway, when I'm creating something like a line, it gives me, it's kind of neat. It gives me a bearing and a distance between vertices. It kind of, you have something on the screen as you do that. It's a little bit annoying, maybe. But is there a setting that I could turn that on and off? Because I kind of remember it not being on at one point, but now it's on. You know what I'm talking about?
Go ahead,
I'm not-
Amy.
I don't remember exactly where that is, but yes, that is a setting that you can turn on and off.
But you don't know where it is.
I'll find it.
Okay, thank you. It's kind of neat. I think I might use it at times, but other times it's a little annoying.
I have used it previously, but that's the reason why I saw Amy shaking her head, and I don't remember where it is, but maybe Amy does.
No, I don't. I don't remember what it is. I know it is a thing.
Yeah, it's very convenient. I agree, Dan. There are times where that would be super helpful. So
Yeah, like making cross sections, you want to go a certain angle.
yeah, absolutely. With cross sections, when you're trying to set up like a geophysical survey or something like that, and you run to set up your survey line and place the survey stations at a specific interval, yeah, it is super helpful. I had to do it manually once. I think it was Sherry asked me to set up a survey line for her, and I had to do it manually. And it was like, oh, shoot, if I had known that that had existed, it'd have been so much easier. But I was too new in ARC at the time to have I was too new to know that it was a thing.
Well, I got another follow-up on that. In ArcMap, I remember it would show on the lower left of the window the distance and the angle, not right by the cursor, but in the lower left of the window, I think it kind of showed you your angles you were going from one vertex to the next. But I don't see that in Arc Pro. I just see the coordinate on the center of the bottom.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think that's a thing in Pro that I have noticed, but this is also part of the reason why we're having Luke present on this, is he's done a lot more digitizing than most of us, other than the mappers, but none of the mappers, except for maybe Michelle, has mapped in Arc Pro yet, because we're just now transitioning to that phase. So that's another thing. Amy, would you mind looking into that and seeing if that's a possibility for us?
Can you repeat the question?
In the bottom left-hand corner in ArcMap, it would display the angle and distance from the previous vertice. And I don't remember seeing that, as partly why I say that. So that may be another specific user setting that we need to look into. So
Okay. I don't remember that, but
I don't either, but Dan says it
I
was
think I
there. I
remember that
believe
right.
it.
Yeah. I look at ArcMap again, I guess.
I'm going to jump in here real quick. I have to go to class, but thank you all. I hope you have a great afternoon. And yeah, if you have any additional questions, you can either relay them to Phil, or you can place them in the comments in the YouTube video, and I can see them there too. So
Thank you,
Thank you,
Luke. That was a
Luke.
nice presentation.
thank you all. Thank you.
So one more thing, Phil. So Bezier curves used to be a no-no, but I guess we could use Bezier curves now.
Yeah,
in
and I
Arc
was
Pro.
going to touch on that. There's a few topics that I wanted to chime into, but I didn't think were important to hang Luke up when he could answer your questions directly. So I'm going to go through those really quick. That is one of them. The very first comment I'll make is I recommend that you set a 1-to-1 zoom scale. And the reason why is when you're working on topology, it's the only way sometimes to see those itty bitty dangles. And if you don't have that set, it can do weird things. It's nice to have that 1-to-1. I personally do exactly the same thing. I've got a set of zoom scales that I just use pretty much constantly and keep those retained. And one of them is the 1-to-1, and that is for the error inspector. The other comment is Dan's question. Previously, we couldn't use freehand. And the reason why is when you drew Bezier curves and then did feature to polygon, the polygon creation wouldn't honor the Bezier curves. It would only make straight line segments. So I'm going to try and see if I can open a whiteboard really quick and do a little sketch so I can demonstrate this so that it's understood what I'm saying. So if we have our Bezier curve that's something like this, and this is a vertex, 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 and they each have their handles, what would happen when we made polygons is it wouldn't honor the Bezier curve. It would make the polygon shaped like this. And that violates contacts must cover map unit polys. So they would show up as absolute errors. So very early on, there's some things that we could have done to have dealt with it, but I recognized right off the bat, streaming is kind of an easier way of doing it. Bezier curves is data friendly, but this problem occurs. And our workflow, it's so much easier to create polygons over and over. And with the tool, and there's a couple different ways that we could deal with that, but now we tested this. Bezier curves, when you do feature to polygon, are honored from the line work to the polygons so that topology error doesn't come up. So it's really handy. So that is one of the comments that I wanted to make, absolutely. And the reason why freehand was a thing, what was not a usable thing, was because of this error that it created. And the process of correcting for it was doable, but you had to go in and do a couple tools, and then us GISers, the cartographers, would be modifying your data. Okay, we would honor, the accuracy, precision of it when we were doing that smoothing, when we were going from a smooth Bezier curve to a simplified curve. And simplified means straight line vertices. So simplify versus smooth. That's the differential that occurs. So we decided that instead of having us be an influence in your data, let's get you to capture your data that way. So that's the reason why. And now it honors the Bezier curves, so we can make polygons that way. The other comment that I wanted to touch on was, again, we've already touched on it, but set your data source ID for a project when you get it. Make sure you just go in, and for all of your create features templates, just go ahead and assign every single one of them to be your name. It'll be something like DS Daniel J. Koning or something like that. The people that are making the list are having fun with that. So I am data source Darth Miller. I am DS Darth Miller. So, we're having fun with it. We would prefer you use your professional names. Us cartographers, we're not data sources in that. So we're getting away with being flippant. But again, we want to tie this to your specific published author name like we do in the database. We want it to be that official name. And then we talked about the reason why rotate was problematic and the fact that it added extra precision to that orientation field, to the azimuth field, that isn't true for the accuracy and precision. So those are the comments that I wanted to make. So thank you for asking that question, Dan. Absolutely. That is a deviation from how we used to do things. Bezier curves were a no-no. Now it's a free-for-all. Okay, maybe I shouldn't have said that.
And Phil, I know, like under modified, so there's a lot of different functions. I know a lot of them, but it might be good to have a session explaining all the
cool.
things you can do.
Absolutely. I will add that to the list. And that brings me to another comment that I would be happy to make. Sorry, I'm looking for my page of topics to discuss. Next week, we won't have a session because of NMGS. And so instead of trying to double those meetings up for people, we decided to go ahead and skip. The following week, I believe, is the 26th. Sorry, let me pull up my calendar. So the 26th, that one will be, we will talk about metadata and entering in metadata. Now, the statement I'll make for most of the mappers is it's not critical because we have worked up an extensive list of metadata for the geodatabase. You probably won't have to enter any of that information in. However, because aquifer mapping is generating directly data from the research, the question came up from Layla about how and where do we enter in metadata. So I wanted to go through the process of making sure that we cover the metadata that really matters for the geodatabase and then talk about the other areas where metadata comes into play. So that'll be the week after next. And Dan, I added to the list modify tools, and we'll go over all of those in a future series session. Are there any other questions that pertain to this presentation?
One more comment from me on topology. As long as you set up your own projects without not a state map project, but you want to use topology. And I remember, creating topology rules. Maybe a session, or if you want to address it now, how do you create topology?
It's already on the list.
It's on the list. Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely on the list. Yeah, the ones that I have listed currently are let's see, metadata. We covered the settings one, topology and map review, and now the modify tool.
Okay. Is layout different than ArcMap? I didn't really play with layout.
Layout is different, and I want to go into the difference at some point with regard to you can now in a pro project have effectively, I don't know if this is literal, infinite number of layouts and infinite number of map panes, map views. So what you can do with that is I've done this currently with the index map for the one that's typically in the hallway. The index map that we use for our fact sheet and the index map that we use for our state map proposal, that's all in one project now. And I only enter in the data in that database and modify things that are pinging the literal flat table database and the feature class database. So I now have one location to update all of my index maps. So with that, there's lots of things to discover and disclose to you all with that. There will be a session on doing layout changes and things like that, how to place maps, how to configure them, what it means for turning things off. Like we saw, you can close a view and then go into the catalog and actually open that view back up. You don't lose those layouts. So yeah, we can absolutely go into the details of that. Sure. I'll add that one to the list too. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and end this session and stop recording, and we can now use this time for working on other questions that you have that, again, may end up becoming future topics as well.